a hotel room for $89, room service for $137, and a call from your credit card company revealing your fiancé is with another man? Priceless. At least I didn't marry her. That was the consolation I heard often in the years that followed. Yet, it offered no real comfort. We hadn't taken vows, but in my heart, I was already committed to her. The breakup stung as much as I imagined a divorce would. But let me start from the beginning. It was the early 1980s. I had just returned to the United States after nearly 2 years stationed in Japan with the Air Force. My new assignment was at Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, not too far from home. I was young, full of ambition, and eager to wrap up my military service with as little hassle as possible. While I enjoyed being an Air Force cop, my long-term goals extended far beyond the military. As a kid, I'd always dreamed of becoming a police officer. But by the time I was ready to apply to the local police academy after high school, the odds were stacked against me. The city was facing severe budget cuts under the mayor's administration, with fire, police, and other essential services taking the hardest hits. Cadet classes were slashed, and applicants were now required to have at least 2 years of college and prior law enforcement experience. 18-year-olds fresh out of high school didn't stand a chance. Years later, crime rates soared, and emergency services earned a national reputation for being some of the worst in the country. Although subsequent mayors tried to fix the mess, the damage was already done. But that's another story. At the time, I needed both practical experience and some college credits to have a shot at a career in law enforcement. When the local sheriff's department turned me down, I turned to the Air Force, which approved my first choice: law enforcement. It was far better than ending up as security police, guarding airplane hangars or bomb storage bunkers in miserable weather conditions. The job had its ups and downs. Being a junior enlisted airman wasn't exactly glamorous. Emergencies often meant 12-hour shifts with no days off for weeks. Still, I had a supportive boss, our top enlisted leader, who valued education and encouraged airmen to pursue college classes. He made sure I could attend my evening courses, even during base alerts or extended shifts. Japan itself, however, remained largely unexplored for me. My workload kept me confined to the base, leaving little time for adventures off duty. So, when I returned to the States for my next assignment, I hoped things might change. Kelly Air Force Base was enormous, but my unit was stationed at a remote annex called Security Hill, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Shuttle buses to the main base were infrequent, and even with a car, it felt isolated. The nearest community college wasn't close enough to make attending classes feasible. On top of that, our duty shifts rotated monthly, making any attempt at education practically impossible. My new job wasn't terrible, but it was mind-numbingly dull compared to my previous post. Back in Japan, duties were rotated, so I had experience with everything: disturbance calls, traffic control, and base operations. At Security Hill, I sat at a desk all day, checking security badges and drowning in paperwork. Even the dorm life was uneventful. My roommate Brad liked to go clubbing every weekend, but his love for country music clashed with my preference for 70s British progressive rock. For the most part, I stayed in. Over time, though, the monotony got to me. One night, I gave in and joined Brad at a local club. That's when I met Leah. Like the Beatles song says, I saw her standing there. She was about my age, standing in a corner with a friend, sipping a drink. She didn't seem to fit the scene, looking detached from the music and the crowd. Earlier, another guy had asked her to dance. She'd accepted, but it was clear she didn't know the steps and had to improvise awkwardly. He didn't ask her again, choosing to dance with her friend instead. Leah grew visibly restless as the night went on. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, and she didn't have the polished appearance of some of the other women there, but there was something captivating about her, something that made her stand out from the crowd. In the club, she looked like someone's lost kid sister, the classic girl next door type who had wandered into the wrong place and now found herself stuck in an unfamiliar and slightly hostile world. Her auburn brown hair, a shade I've always favored, hung long but lacked the vibrant shine of health. Her cheeks looked a little hollow, and her complexion was uneven, as if she hadn't been feeling well for some time. She didn't appear to wear much makeup, if any, which made her seem even more out of place. Tall and thin, she carried herself in a way that almost shrank her presence, hunching her shoulders as though trying to disappear into the background. Despite these surface flaws, she had an intangible quality, a spark of something different. With her friend now occupied on the dance floor, I decided to make my move. Hi, I said, gesturing at the wall we both seemed intent on holding up. Since neither of us looks like we'll be dancing tonight, I figured I'd help you keep this section from collapsing. It wasn't particularly clever or witty, but it was honest, and that seemed to matter more. She gave me a faint smile but didn't walk away, which I took as a good sign. We started talking, discovering that we both hated the country music blaring from the speakers. When we discussed our favorite bands, we were worlds apart. She loved heavy metal, especially AC/DC and Ozzy Osbourne, while my tastes leaned toward Genesis, Pink Floyd, and Yes. Led Zeppelin was the only common ground we could find. An hour later, we were at a nearby Denny's, sharing life stories over endless orders of English muffins. She ate like she hadn't had a decent meal in days, and, as it turned out, she really hadn't. She was living with some friends, splitting a tiny apartment, and they could barely afford groceries. Her part-time job as a hostess at a local restaurant paid next to nothing, and she didn't get a share of the tips. The following Friday, we planned a proper date, a nice dinner and a movie, but a quick stop at my dorm room derailed those plans. Our plans for dinner and a movie quickly changed when we lost track of time talking and enjoying each other's company. By the time we left, it was already late, so we opted for a quiet meal at Denny's. The intimacy between us felt natural and unforced. Neither of us was inexperienced, but it had been a while for both of us. There was something different, something special about being together. Soon it became harder and harder to say goodnight. We started calling each other every evening and sneaking in moments together whenever possible. When my shift rotated to swings, our schedule unexpectedly aligned. She'd finish work around 10 and wait for me at Denny's. By midnight, I'd join her, grab a bite, and then head back to her apartment. Most nights, I stayed over, and we spent hours talking and connecting in ways that made it harder and harder to say goodbye. I barely made it back to my dorm most mornings in time to start my shift. 3 weeks into this routine, I realized I wanted to marry her. When I proposed, she hesitated but didn't outright refuse. I pushed for a quick engagement and a short path to the altar, but she resisted. Her reasoning was vague. Things had been tough for her lately, and she needed time to get her head on straight. Looking back, her reluctance should have been a warning. She was often nervous and easily overwhelmed, her emotions swinging wildly between extremes. At times, she was hyper-affectionate, clinging to me as though I was her anchor. Other times, she became distant, withdrawing completely from any physical touch. She'd oscillate between restless energy, talking so quickly I could barely understand her, to complete emotional withdrawal. These signs, in hindsight, were glaring red flags, but I chalked it all up to pre-wedding jitters. I thought giving her some space might help, so I cooled things down, hoping she'd feel less pressured. Still, the wedding date remained up in the air. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was my last day of swing shift, and around 6:30 that evening, the branch manager from my credit union called. One of the few perks of being stationed at Security Hill was having the military credit union nearby. They handled all my direct deposits, offered great loan rates for cars and homes, and even issued low interest rate credit cards. I'd gotten one for emergencies and barely used it. At the time I set up my accounts, I opted for a low-use credit card as a precaution. To ensure security, I authorized the credit union to investigate any and all transactions on the card and provided them with both my duty and dorm room phone numbers for immediate contact. This was back in the days before electronic verification, when most places used carbon imprints of cards, making credit card theft rampant. While stationed in Japan, I'd seen the fallout of this firsthand, filing stolen credit card reports for other service members almost weekly. Determined not to become a victim, I took every precaution. Or so I thought. The call from customer service came at 6:30 p.m. They asked if I had recently checked into the Marriott Hotel off I-10 in San Antonio. Confused, I immediately said no. A sinking feeling hit me as I checked my wallet and discovered my Visa card was missing, along with nearly $180 in cash I thought I had. The representative informed me that they had no other records of the card being used, but since most places didn't call in or electronically verify transactions, it was still possible the card had already been used elsewhere. Before hanging up, I obtained a callback number and a fraud case number, then contacted the San Antonio Police Department to report the theft. My direct supervisor, a rather useless second lieutenant, initially refused to let me leave the shift to address the issue. However, he was quickly overruled after I called our company first sergeant, who authorized me to leave immediately. 15 minutes later, I arrived at the Marriott. The desk clerk confirmed that I had checked in about an hour earlier. In reality, it was a young couple who had used my name and credit card to book the room. After verifying my identity and reporting the card as stolen, the clerk involved the evening manager, who was incredibly cooperative. The manager contacted SAPD, and officers were dispatched to handle the situation. When the officers arrived, I accompanied them to the room. After verifying with the manager that I was indeed the cardholder, I unlocked the door. The room appeared empty, but the faint sounds of a running shower revealed the couple was inside the bathroom. The room itself was a mess. Shopping bags from several department stores were scattered across the floor, and a large bag from a liquor store sat on the table. On the dresser, I noticed items associated with substance abuse, something I hadn't been prepared to see. At first, I was relieved that the financial damage might not be too severe, since many of the department store purchases could likely be returned. That relief vanished in an instant when the couple stepped out of the bathroom. It was Leah and my roommate Brad. I still don't know what stroke of luck saved me that night. By sheer accident, I had left my .38 service revolver on my desk back at work. Wearing it was a mandatory part of my uniform, and I couldn't recall ever removing it, let alone leaving it behind. It was an unthinkable mistake for any law enforcement officer, let alone someone of my rank. But that night, it saved lives. When they stepped out of the bathroom, visibly startled by the commotion, I felt a surge of anger that I had never experienced before. It was a moment that tested every ounce of my self-control. In that instant, I understood the otherwise unthinkable rage that drives people to commit crimes of passion. If my revolver had been there, I don't know what might have happened. Their reaction to seeing me wasn't any better. Leah looked utterly ashamed, her face pale as tears streamed down her cheeks. Brad, for his part, seemed more angry than embarrassed. Both were handcuffed and taken away in the back of a squad car. But the sight of Leah crying as the officer escorted her out crushed me in a way I hadn't thought possible. The arresting officer, a composed middle-aged woman, must have sensed how deeply the situation had affected me. She insisted that I return to base and let SAPD handle the investigation. With nothing else to do, I complied, finishing the rest of my shift in a daze. The following morning, I reported the theft to the main law enforcement office on base. By 7:59 a.m., I was waiting outside my first sergeant's office. Once inside, I gave him a full, unfiltered account of everything that had happened. He listened, jaw clenched, but found no fault in my actions. Even leaving my firearm unattended, albeit in a secure area, did not go unnoticed. My first sergeant excused me from all duties for 3 days and ordered me to report to the clinic for a narcotics test. Afterward, he insisted I get some rest. Brad, on the other hand, was released from Behar County Jail after 2 days. I never saw him again. Brad faced serious disciplinary action for violating military codes. A thorough investigation uncovered evidence that left no doubt about his activities. Realizing the evidence was stacked against him, Brad wisely pled guilty, receiving a slightly reduced sentence. He served time in a federal facility, though not at a lenient location, and was dishonorably discharged with the usual penalties: loss of all rank, pay, and benefits. Surprisingly, I later heard that Brad successfully appealed to remain in the military. He restarted his career from scratch as an E1, and eventually worked in the Social Actions Group, teaching about narcotics and alcohol abuse. For me, the next 6 months were exhausting. I spent far more time with OSI than I ever cared to, undergoing endless questioning and signing countless statements. OSI treated every airman as guilty until proven innocent. I estimate I spent over 100 hours under their scrutiny. Thankfully, I was eventually cleared of any involvement in Brad's drug dealings, and my service record remained spotless. But that small silver lining did little to ease the storm cloud of my breakup with Leah. Leah faced legal challenges, starting with minor offenses that escalated as authorities uncovered more serious issues. On top of that, there was an outstanding felony warrant for check fraud from another county. When I met with the assistant district attorney, ADA, handling her case, I learned that Leah had been in and out of legal trouble since turning 18. She'd stolen from her own family, though those charges had been dropped. The ADA mentioned a sealed juvenile record, which we couldn't access, but it painted a clear picture of someone with a long history of poor decisions and substance abuse. The ADA told me Leah had been trying to get clean when we met, but the temptation to use again had proven too strong. The ADA strongly advised me not to post Leah's bail, explaining that staying in jail until her trial might be the best thing for her recovery. While I didn't completely agree with this logic, I had to admit that the ADA seemed genuinely invested in Leah's well-being, not just seeking an easy conviction. Leah remained in jail while I tried to move on with my life. Once the financial damage was tallied, it turned out Leah and Brad had spent over $1,400 during their narcotic-fueled shopping spree. Fortunately, I managed to return most of the department store items and received a full credit to my account, except for a few charges: $46 at the liquor store, $79 for the hotel room, and $135 for room service, including a champagne dinner. In fairness, the hotel had followed proper procedures, including verifying the card, so I chose to cover those costs myself. Losing a little over $500 total, including the $180 in stolen cash, felt like a small miracle under the circumstances. Leah eventually pled guilty to all charges. Before her sentencing, she asked if I would visit her. I refused. I was desperately trying to cut her out of my life and erase her from my memories. It was like trying to excise a cancer, an effort that never truly works. The guilt of that night stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about how differently things might have gone if I hadn't left my revolver behind. I couldn't trust myself to face her in jail. I feared I might make a foolish decision, like dropping the theft and fraud charges, or forgiving her entirely, leaving the door open for her to repeat the same destructive cycle. It was safer, I thought, to stay away and let the legal system handle things. I didn't attend Leah's sentencing, but the ADA later informed me that she accepted a plea deal. Leah received a sentence of 7 to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of early parole if she completed a narcotics treatment program. After nearly a year of counseling, she offered to provide me with contact information for the prison where AA had been sent. I declined, making it clear that I had no interest in her well-being. Truthfully, I didn't start caring much about my own either. The last 6 months of my duty in San Antonio were almost unbearable. My lieutenant, clearly holding a grudge over the fact that I had bypassed his authority by going up the chain of command, made it his mission to make my life miserable. He found countless petty ways to harass me, proving how vindictive a second lieutenant with a chip on his shoulder could be. At the time, I was set for an automatic promotion from E3 senior airman to sergeant. This promotion, despite its title, came with no pay increase, just another bizarre and frustrating policy the Air Force seemed to specialize in. One that's hard to explain to civilians. My boss, however, consistently canceled my scheduled attendance at training school, held locally on base, where I was supposed to qualify for the promotion. His micromanagement didn't stop there. He watched me obsessively, scrutinizing every action for trivial infractions. He was determined to ruin my career. Over the course of 6 months, I received 3 letters of reprimand, all for offenses I was certain I hadn't committed. By the time the third one landed on my desk, I had reached my limit. I decided to once again bring my grievances to the first sergeant. Though he listened as I vented my frustrations, it was clear that my short remaining enlistment, just 3 months, severely limited what he could do. Since I hadn't filed for re-enlistment, he wasn't eager to shake up the chain of command for someone who wouldn't be around much longer. Still, to his credit, he recognized something deeper was wrong. After a long pause, he said, "I can't order you to talk to a chaplain, but I'd take it as a personal favor if you'd do so. Pick anyone you like, then come back and talk to me next week." On Security Hill, we didn't have a dedicated chaplain. The nearest one was a Lutheran pastor stationed at the end of the flight line, marginally closer than the main base chapel. He had drawn the short straw and worked out of a modest office there. I decided to meet him, and surprisingly, I liked him instantly. A towering blend of Scandinavian heritage from Minnesota, he was both a psychologist and a pastor, with a laid-back demeanor that put me at ease. I told him my story, about Leah, the discovery at the hotel, and the aftermath. He was perceptive, picking up on the significant details almost immediately. At one point, as I recounted the confrontation, he noted how my hand unconsciously rested on my pistol holster. Piece by piece, I admitted that I had been overwhelmed with anger, and only a twist of fate, or perhaps Providence, helped me hold on to my better judgment. We met daily for an hour over the following week. Slowly, I began to confront an unsettling truth about myself. Since that day, guilt had gnawed at me so deeply that even the act of wearing my pistol holster felt unbearable. Firing the weapon was out of the question. I had always excelled in weapons qualifications, scoring 297 out of 300 with my .38 revolver and earning the Small Arms Expert badge. But during a recent trip to the range, I barely managed a score of 40. Miss after miss underscored the reality. The guilt had compromised my ability to use a weapon. I was no longer comfortable in my role as an enlisted law enforcement officer. Wearing a gun I was psychologically incapable of firing, even in self-defense, was a recipe for disaster. My options were clear: cross-train into a different career field or leave the service altogether. The idea of cross-training appealed to me. When the chaplain casually asked if I could type, I admitted I could. He suggested becoming a chaplain assistant, joking that I could handle his paperwork. We laughed about it, but I realized it wasn't such a bad idea. Transitioning out of law enforcement wasn't easy. Retention rates for our field were low, and the standards were stricter than most other Air Force career paths. Openings for cross-training were scarce, and they usually led to less desirable roles. But, with my first sergeant's help, I managed to transfer into the chaplain assistant training program at Maxwell AFB. I re-enlisted for 4 more years. To my surprise, I loved the new job. It encompassed far more than clerical work, involving crisis intervention, suicide prevention, emergency stress management, and even domestic disputes. Whether dealing with plane crashes or natural deaths, the role required constant engagement. For every hour spent on reports or sermon coordination, I spent dozens helping people in crisis, either over the phone or in person. By the time I earned my promotion to staff sergeant and later to technical sergeant, I had secretaries to handle the administrative tasks. Interestingly, my lack of religious fervor was never an issue. Nowhere in my job description did it require me to attend services, though I needed to be familiar with all faiths to coordinate activities. Over time, I became the senior NCOIC, managing teams that supported chaplains from various backgrounds: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and more. When emergencies struck, whether it was a Baptist minister, a Catholic priest, or a rabbi being called at 3 in the morning, I was always the next person on the list. Regardless of faith, these chaplains approached their duties with equal dedication, and I never encountered a single problem working with any of them. The crisis intervention work I handled during my military career was incredibly fulfilling. Still, as I moved into the second half of my 20 years of service, I found myself taking increasing satisfaction in the more routine aspects of my role, organizing youth groups and various outreach programs. My drinking had also dwindled significantly by then. While I occasionally enjoyed a glass of red wine, my priorities had shifted. I began co-hosting Base Alcoholics Anonymous meetings with the Social Actions team and even collaborated with off-base programs, where it wasn't uncommon to see military members discreetly seeking help. The military has always had a complicated and at times hypocritical stance on substance abuse. Heavy drinking was practically a cultural expectation, often met with little more than a slap on the wrist. But for someone caught with marijuana or other substances, the fallout could be career-ending. Those struggling with more severe dependencies, at least the smarter ones, usually sought help off base to avoid jeopardizing their future. I wrapped up my final tour of duty back in San Antonio, this time stationed at Lackland Air Force Base. As the hub of basic training, numerous technical schools, and home to Wilford Hall, the Air Force's largest hospital, Lackland was a busy and challenging post. I served as the senior enlisted leader, managing a staff of hundreds and overseeing services for tens of thousands of people daily. By this stage, I had a team of younger NCOs to handle the middle-of-the-night calls, but I made a point to stay engaged, especially with personal crises. I had earned the rank of Senior Master Sergeant a while back, and was presented with the opportunity to advance to Chief Master Sergeant, the pinnacle of the enlisted ranks. But by then, I had decided it was time to move on. 20 years of service was enough, and I wasn't eager to spend my remaining days wading through military politics. A promotion to chief would eventually lead me to the Pentagon, advising senior officers on long-term policies. Frankly, the thought of sitting at a desk pushing policy papers for the rest of my career didn't appeal to me at all. I had never married, though it wasn't for a lack of desire. The nature of my work often brought me into contact with people dealing with significant personal issues, which wasn't exactly conducive to forming meaningful connections. Women I met off base were usually part of church groups or organizations I worked with, but they often fell into two categories: overzealous churchgoers or highly organized professionals who loved to micromanage. I never got along particularly well with either. Military women close to my age were typically already married, divorced with children from multiple partners, or uninterested in settling down. Those who were single often carried significant personal baggage. I wasn't inclined to revisit the dating scene at local bars either. I'd seen far too many military divorces begin with the phrase, "Well, I met her at a bar." While I hoped to find someone and build a lifelong relationship, I wasn't about to risk repeating my past mistakes. The memory of Leah had left a lasting impression. Although I wasn't living a monastic life, regular intimacy wasn't a feature of my reality either. With less than a month left before retirement, I had no concrete plans for my post-military life. My pension would be enough to get by, and I intended to stay in the area for a while, maybe explore opportunities in youth outreach or community affairs within a larger church. My expectations were modest, though. Many local churches were Southern Baptist or Catholic, neither of which aligned particularly well with my beliefs. The few remaining options were often just as conservative, likely requiring more prayerful dedication than I was accustomed to giving. A position at the Behar County Social Services Office had been an option. However, their strict seniority-based promotion system offered no room for merit-based advancement. Starting near the bottom of their ladder, dealing with crack-addicted mothers and their children every day, wasn't something I could see myself doing for long. I declined. Another possibility was with the local United Way office, but it promised long hours, low pay, and office politics I didn't want to deal with. That was when a strange letter arrived from a church in nearby Lubbock, Texas. The details intrigued me. The letter outlined some basic information, and after checking their rudimentary website, I pieced together a few more insights. This wasn't your typical church, locally referred to as simply the church. It was uniquely situated near a community known for its unconventional lifestyle, blending the traditional with the unexpected. In practice, this arrangement didn't matter much to the vast majority of the county. 98% of people ignored the church altogether, leaving it in an oddly fascinating niche. This church was, by far, the largest in the county, and it handled an extensive range of civic projects, almost by default. At first glance, I was tempted to dismiss them as eccentric outliers, but the more I learned, the more intrigued I became. Their work stretched far beyond Sunday services. They managed the county's food pantry for the poor, built homes for low-income families, repaired homes for seniors, provided free breakfasts for children during the school year, and lunches for low-income kids during the summer. On top of that, they ran the county's crisis management services, hosted monthly job fairs, and offered weekly AA, Nar-Anon, and anger management meetings. Youth groups and scouting programs, the usual fare for a church, were just a fraction of their outreach efforts. The more I read, the more I wanted to meet the person behind this enormous operation. The head pastor, Benedict, or Father Ben, as he was known locally, seemed like a man with both the vision and the boldness to pull off something so ambitious. Given Lubbock's reputation for being an unusual place, having an equally unusual pastor wasn't entirely surprising. When I finally met him, Father Ben was a jovial man with a round belly and an even bigger heart. His age was hard to pin down. He had been in Lubbock since the late 1960s, but didn't look much older than me, except for his eyes. His deep, dark eyes seemed to bore straight into a person's soul, revealing hidden truths. They reminded me of an old World War II veteran I once met, a man who had been among the first to liberate a concentration camp. Those eyes had witnessed horrors that could never be forgotten. Father Ben was looking for a top director of church services, someone to oversee everything the church managed outside of Sunday morning worship. It was a colossal job, easily enough to keep 5 people working non-stop from dawn until midnight, assuming no 3 a.m. emergency calls came in. If I were offered the position, my staff would consist of only 2 people, a part-time motorcycle mechanic named Tiny, who oversaw most of the children's programs, and a long-serving church secretary. The compensation for the role was, to put it mildly, abysmal, bordering on laughable. During our interview, I admitted up front that I understood the financial limitations. Any salary they paid me would mean less money for repairing a widow's roof next week, or feeding a struggling family. Father Ben nodded, explaining that they weren't looking for someone motivated by money. The ideal candidate would view this not as a job, but as a calling, something they would do simply because it needed to be done. The job's scope seemed to expand every week as the church took on responsibilities that the county government struggled to manage. At first, I had my doubts about the unconventional setup, but I quickly realized how serious the congregation was about maintaining a safe and respectful environment. Their unwavering commitment to accountability left no room for misconduct of any kind. As we spoke, Father Ben delved deeper into my military career and personal history. His questions were precise, growing more challenging as the conversation went on. It became increasingly clear that evasion wasn't an option. Not that I had planned to lie, but his probing made it impossible to sidestep or obscure the full truth. He asked what I had most liked and disliked about my work as a chaplain assistant. I admitted that I hated the politics and found it draining to deal daily with people who had far worse problems than I did. I was also candid about my own flaws, recounting them in painful detail. I even shared how my career had begun in law enforcement and how a near-catastrophic mistake had haunted me for years, ultimately driving me to change paths. At this, Father Ben smiled kindly and asked the big question, the one I had been avoiding for over 15 years. Tell me about the worst pain someone has ever caused you, and did you ever forgive them for it? Oh God. I began by telling him about the issues I had with my former commanding officer at Security Hill, but before I knew it, the real story came pouring out, the one I'd buried for so long. I spoke about my love for Leah, her addiction, and her betrayal. An hour later, I found myself sitting in his office, sobbing uncontrollably. He had peeled away every protective layer I had built around my heart over the years, leaving me raw and exposed. The pain felt as fresh as if it had just happened yesterday. No, I admitted when I could finally speak again. I never forgave her. Maybe because deep down, I never stopped loving her. This answer seemed to satisfy Father Ben. He leaned back and regarded me thoughtfully before asking the final, piercing question. But today, he said, his voice calm and steady, if she were to walk into this room, could you forgive her in your heart and begin to move on from there? I don't know. That was the only honest answer I could give when Father Ben asked if I could forgive Leah if she walked into the room that very moment. I said all the right things about how I wanted to forgive, how I should be able to, and so on. But when it came to a simple, firm yes or no, I couldn't bring myself to decide. The pain of that experience was as raw and consuming as it had ever been, and I felt trapped in it once again. Father Ben didn't push me further. That's a good, honest answer, he said. It'll do for now. Let's talk about working with the folks who'd be your staff. We went over a range of potential challenges. Could I work well with an ex-biker named Tiny, a tattooed giant who looked like he could snap me in half with a flick of his pinky but, in reality, was gentle as a lamb? No problem. Could I handle working with recovering addicts trying to reform their lives? Absolutely. I told him about my work with AA and Nar-Anon over the years. Then came the final hurdle. If I told you, Father Ben began, that our outstanding church secretary, someone who has been an invaluable part of our work for nearly 10 years, once faced significant struggles with addiction, could you still work with her? She made mistakes in her past, including breaking the trust of those closest to her, but she turned her life around while serving time. Since then, she has become an inspiring example of redemption and change. I trust her with my life and my checkbook. Could you do the same? Could you look beyond her past and see her for the remarkable person she is today? I paused for a moment, considering. Yes, I said finally. I think so. I've learned a lot about the devastating choices addicts make, how they hurt themselves and others. But I also have immense respect for those who claw their way out of that abyss and rebuild their lives. Father Ben smiled. Good. Let me introduce you to our secretary, assuming, of course, you were to accept the position. He didn't need to say her name. I already knew. The church secretary was Leah, or, as she now called herself, Leanna. When she walked in, we avoided each other's eyes at first, both of us suddenly fascinated by the intricate patterns of the Persian rug on Father Ben's office floor. Eventually, we greeted each other by name and extended our hands for a formal shake. But that formality didn't last. Within moments, we were hugging each other tightly, tears streaming down our faces. That hug marked the end of the interview. With a playful wink, Father Ben declared, "It seems like you two have some catching up to do." We did, for the next 4 hours, at a cozy old-fashioned diner just down the road from the church. It was within sight of the beach, a fitting backdrop for the emotional tide we were navigating. Over coffee and pie, Leah told me everything. She'd been clean when we first met, but the environment she was in made it difficult to stay on the right path. Under pressure, she began making poor choices again, and it led her back to struggles she thought she had overcome. Her addiction led her to make terrible choices. She needed money for drugs and ended up losing her job at the restaurant due to suspicions of theft. Suspicions that were well-founded but never proven. My old roommate Brad discovered her struggles and used them to manipulate her, exploiting her vulnerability to his own advantage. This drove her further into a cycle she couldn't escape. Brad had started using and dealing himself, his judgment clouded by his own growing dependence. Together, they stole my wallet and credit card, going on a shopping spree I didn't even know about until later. By that point, Leah was trapped in a vicious cycle, doing unthinkable things with untrustworthy people, all while spiraling toward rock bottom. The pressure of keeping her behavior hidden from me, the man she claimed to love and wanted to protect, pushed her to the brink of a breakdown. She admitted that she had loved me enough to resist marrying me, knowing that as a full-fledged addict, she'd inevitably hurt me. What she hadn't anticipated was me finding her with one of her pimps in that hotel room. That was her lowest moment, even worse than the betrayal itself. She later realized that she should have come to me for help, told me the truth. But her love for me was laced with fear. Fear of losing the only person who had ever genuinely cared for her. When the awful truth finally came to light in a San Antonio jail, it was too late. I knew without a doubt that back then, I would not have forgiven her. I wouldn't have let her back into my life, much less my heart. If faced with the truth at the time, I probably would have unleashed a storm of angry words I'd later regret. And, in response to that rejection, she would have likely abandoned any desire for rehabilitation. Upon her release from prison, she might have fallen back into addiction, becoming just another lost soul living under a bridge, recycling cans, and selling her body for her next fix. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, she fought for rehabilitation with determination and, after serving only a few years under parole, built a new life. She began working in social services, helping other addicts navigate the same abyss she had once fallen into. Her journey eventually brought her to the church, by sheer coincidence, while on a trip. She stayed, making the church the cornerstone of her new life. She wasn't fully immersed in the lifestyle, and neither of our roles required us to participate. Still, I couldn't help but admire her confidence and the way she carried herself. We left that diner as friends, but for the first time in 16 years, I felt like the wounds on my heart had been dressed with the right bandage. For the first time, it felt like those wounds could finally begin to heal. The following Tuesday morning, back in San Antonio, I found an official job offer waiting in my mailbox. Would I accept it? I wanted to. I was 99% sure that this was where I was supposed to be at this point in my life. But that one lingering percent held me back. I needed a few days to think it over. Father Ben assured me there was no rush, no pressure. Had I forgiven Liana? Yes. I truly believed I had. Could I work with her every day? That was the real question. I knew one thing for certain. I still loved her, and she still loved me. All these years, we had waited, each of us single, never marrying anyone else. Maybe it was meant to be all along, some path preordained by fate. But if I stepped through that door and accepted the job, it wouldn't be a slow, tentative journey back into each other's lives. I knew exactly what would happen. We'd hug again, as old friends who had finally found one another. Lunches and dinners would follow. Soon, we'd be holding hands, and before long, we'd kiss. Then, there would be breakfast together, shared mornings, and eventually, marriage. Neither of us was built to live life halfway, and that's the thing. I couldn't commit to any of this unless I was 100% sure. I needed to know, deep in my soul, that when I woke up next to her, I would see only the woman I loved, not the shadows of the past. Could I make that decision today? No. Probably not tomorrow either, and likely not during the 3 weeks I had left in uniform. But I knew that once my retirement ceremony was over and I hung up my uniform for the last time, that final 1% of doubt would resolve itself. And when it did, I was certain I'd be able to live with my decision for the rest of my life.